Welcome to Third and Fairfax, the official podcast of the Writers Guild of America West. I'm your host, Brian Gary. On this episode, I talk with Ahsoka creator and Mandalorian writer Dave Filoni about his expanding the Star Wars universe, his new role as Lucasfilm's chief content officer, and much more. Listen and subscribe to Third and Fairfax on Spotify, Apple, or Libsyn, and watch us on the Writers Guild of America West's YouTube channel. And now, my conversation with Dave Filoni. I am sitting here with Dave Filoni, who, among many things, is a writer, a producer, a showrunner, a leader of all things Star Wars and content and story over at Disney right now. So you're wearing many, many hats. You're actually wearing a hat today, but you wear many, many hats. I want to dive right into the middle. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about Ahsoka, both the show and the character, et cetera. But I want to dive right into the middle. We have a lot of writers, professional writers, existing writers, and aspiring writers who listen to the show. And I think you offer a really interesting perspective, Dave, because you have taken this character, Ahsoka, you generated it, but it first was conceived inside of an animated series. And then you saw the transition to a live action. And that's probably very rarefied air that you would create a character in one medium, see the transition, be a part of it. It actually introduced the Mandalorian, but then becomes its own show. So let's start with the conversation about how you approach these different mediums, and that your anchor of this character that you've now seen grow up and evolve, et cetera, across the mediums. How did you have to approach it as a writer, as a producer, et cetera, differently as you were making these transitions, because you were the one who was doing it?
Well, I think the biggest, most important thing about it all was I wasn't alone in it. From the beginning at Lucasfilm, I was very fortunate that George Lucas was going to be working with us on the Clone Wars. And, to have the guy that created all of Star Wars working with you to kind of guide you and tell you yes and no on things is a huge help. It gives you a lot of confidence that, well, if George said that, that's the way we're going to go. And then you execute to the best of your ability. I didn't start on Clone Wars thinking I was going to write anything. I came in as a animation director. I had directed one season on a show called The Last Airbender, Nickelodeon, created by my friends Mike and Brian, and I loved that experience. And like everyone, I'd always loved Star Wars and was a big fan. And I got an opportunity to work at Lucasfilm and be the supervising director. So that was a big deal. But one of the things I was relieved about was that the writing was all on Henry Gilroy. He was going to have to take that on. And I remember we went to a screening of Empire Strikes Back at the Egyptian Theater before we went up to Lucasfilm. And just watching Empire, I just looked at Henry and I said, oh, man, can you do that? That's really, the dialogue here is really good. Just joking with him. But it's Star Wars is a specific thing, and it's challenging. And it's, like any writing, it's very personal to who you are and what you bring to it. So it became clear working with George that, he's a director that writes his own stuff, and that he expected me to learn to write, because especially in editorial, he wanted me to, go over things and change the dialogue and improve it. And, so I learned alongside George. I learned alongside Henry. I had a lot of support in my early days of writing. And when I go, maybe any of us, when we go back and look at what we first did, you can cringe a bit, you're like, wow, really figuring that out. That's on the nose. And, also episodically in animation, we made so many episodes, you got to learn across the seasons. So we weren't just improving the animation, the way it looked, the way it rendered. We were improving, the voice of the characters and learning that voice. And, sitting at an editorial room and having George say, well, Obi-Wan would probably say this, and then he just riffs off a line and you're like, yeah, that's Obi-Wan. Like, you could just hear it coming from him, and it really helped to understand the voice. So animation gave me a whole lot of experience to succeed and fail, to try things that worked and to see what didn't work. And as we went, hopefully, we all like to think it got better and better as we went. And then again, as far as like learning from someone, when I got to live action, when Disney came in and bought the company, and Kathleen Kennedy was here, she asked me, well, what would I like to do? And I said, well, working with George, I really am interested in live action. I'd like to see if I'm capable of that. And so she set up a situation where I could go and visit J.J. Abrams when he was working on set, Ryan Johnson, just because I told her I want to be in the environment. I want to see what the environment's like. I think I have to understand what all these people are doing if I'm going to have to be responsible for them and all their work. So I would just go and observe. And really, Ryan was the guy who just grabbed me and shoved me up by the camera and put a lens in my hand and said, look at this and look at that and look at this. And, you know, he was very adamant that it was something I could do. And I had met Jon Favreau years ago when I worked on Clone Wars. And his son was actually the first person outside the studio to ever see our new animated Clone Wars. He was making Iron Man at the ranch. And so we kind of connected over that. And it was just, you know, very providential because years later, when he was pitching Mando, Kathy said, Dave has a lot of experience with this. You should talk to him. And he knew who I was. And so we immediately connected, as fans and friends. And having John there as I transitioned from writing animation to writing live action, I think was a very big deal.
So I just want to ask you a question. Yeah. I just want to, before we
sorry,
get to,
I told you I'm a talker. So
no, I love it.
Anytime you need. Sorry.
No, you're spinning a good story. And so before we fully transition from the animation and move into the live action, I think it's really interesting how you talked about, without saying the word, apprenticeship. And, because, for hundreds, if not 1,000 years, our art form has always been a form of apprenticeship. Actually, all the kind of performing arts. If you wanted to be an actor, you would go and you would become part of a theater troupe, and you would learn, you would build sets, and you would do things, and you would be part of this apprenticeship. Same thing with writing. And even in the early days of television, you would come in and you would learn. You would first be an assistant, and you would kind of see, just like you said, I want to see what people are doing on the set. That's eroded a bit, that apprenticeship. So the fact that you really benefited and you can focus on that area of apprenticeship that allowed you to kind of see the transition first in from doing the animation, and then doing the writing of the scripts, and then transitioning to live action. But as we look at the animation, what's really fascinating about that is, and it's going to get to our later questions about canon and the universe and franchise and all that. But I'm sure you do, because you have to police it on one side and exploit it on the other side. So, but in terms of looking at these worlds, I think people forget that outside of the original movies, and this is even before JJ comes in and starts the last three, is outside of those movies, there was the apocryphal attempt at a live action at one point that kind of had some development. It's probably more lore than anything else now. It was the Clone Wars. The Clone Wars, that was Star Wars outside of the movies. And for a lot of people, a lot of kids especially, their introduction to Star Wars was the Clone Wars, the animated series, and the movies, the animated movies, et cetera, the part of it. So in terms of world building and being a part of these massive worlds, and again, obviously you're beside George Lucas when you're doing this, especially those early seasons, how did you approach coming into this thing that had these iconic films, and yet in many ways you are building this world out for a whole new generation of people to experience Star Wars?
That's interesting. I don't know, when you put it like that, it's just something naturally that I did. I didn't think of it in any grandiose way, to be honest with you. And I don't know, there were a couple of things about it. I had obviously soaked up a lot of Star Wars knowledge. My first job in the industry was on King of the Hill. I think everything, shapes what you're going to be able to
George Lucas, Mike Judge.
For sure. Well, I got to say, it's worth saying that's an incredibly well-written show.
Yeah.
And if nothing else, I mean, it taught me about, the family dynamic in it, the situations in it. We drew it in a very kind of traditional, wanting to be sitcom 3-camera way in its inception. When I started drawing it, I had an episode where Hank went to the Dallas Cowboys training camp. And so I shot it more like The Natural. I say shot it, but I drew it.
Sure.
And the writers get all very excited about that, um, but it informs, who you're learning all the time. To your point of mentorship, you're learning all the time. I love stories about mentorship. As an artist, my family, my father was an architect, and also staged opera. My mother was a musician and a music therapist. The arts were something that were very well supported growing up. It wasn't something that seemed ridiculous to them that I'd want to engage in. It was well supported in many ways, and that was important. The idea that I would have a mentor was something my parents were aware of. They're like, as an artist, it's important. And over the years, I could run down a list of people like Joe Horn in animation, Sean Cashman, like different people that really made an impact and taught me stuff. So when I got to George, it's just obvious he's immensely knowledgeable. And just what struck me was when we sat down, when I interviewed for the job of supervising this show, supervising director, he explained basically what Jedi are and how the Force works. He looked through my portfolio very quickly, which I thought, yeah, I'm not getting this job, because I'd never done computer animation before. I was all hand drawn 2D. I'd only directed one season of anything. So, underqualified would be a nice way of putting it, I thought. But my whole goal was
How did we
to.
go from propane to the Force? Is basically what
Oh,
he.
well, that was, I was a film Roman. Yeah, that's its own little journey, I suppose.
Yeah.
But in the meeting with George, what struck me was when he started explaining Star Wars to me, just in a very natural way. I was like, yeah, that was the way I understood it. What was in a fun way, a lot of things he was saying about how Jedi are, how they react, what the Force is. I was like, oh, I was right and my friends were wrong. That was, just naturally, I was inclined that what George has been saying in the films, I think that I was in tune with. And I thought he was very nice. You're always worried meeting someone that you would look up to like that, but he was super nice. I shook his hand, said, it's very nice to meet you, because I thought that was it. And I thought I'd have this great story for in line at the movies. And, I met George Lucas once. Isn't that great? But then I got hired on, and that's when it really, we thought we were hired, Henry and I, to do this show, Clone Wars. We thought, an animated series would be about 2 years. I'll move up to Marin or something and live there, I guess. I don't know what that's like. I've never been there. 2 years, then I'll come back. And what an experience I'll have had. And, we had some preliminary meetings with George about what Clone Wars was going to be about and how he saw it was going to be structured. At first, Henry and I went in with an idea that didn't include Anakin and Obi-Wan, because we didn't want to dare touch his characters. We didn't presume that. But George was like, no, that's what kids want. They know these characters. It's going to be about them, but we'll take this character you have and we'll make her Anakin's apprentice. And that's how Ahsoka came about, because she was a
Oh,
character
so
that we
she
had.
was in the original pitch. She was in your original pitch.
She
Ahsoka
was in
was.
the original
Oh,
idea to have a Jedi
yeah.
Padawan,
Okay.
but George wanted this Padawan and he wanted it to be a Twi'lek. And then I was like, well, let's do it to Gruta, because I knew he liked them. I liked the design of it more, that particular alien. And he just picked up a history book and found the name Ahsoka from history, because he has all these books surrounding him. But he set us up, and we thought, okay, now we'll get going and make the show. But then when we went to watch the edit of the first episode, George sat in with us and watched it, and then he's like, okay, we have a lot of work to do. And he sat with us for 2 solid days. And I mean, from 8 in the morning would start till late in the evening editing, like we're editing a movie. And he would work on the edit with us and re-edit and explain why he was changing stuff. And that's when I think we realized, we're in this deep. Like, he's making Star Wars. There's no concession here that this is like an animated version. We're making Star Wars. And George would cut live action footage from other movies into what we were editing if we didn't have shots. It became like just a full education on how he assembled the story. But the world of Star Wars and the world building of it was something that, listening to him and watching him work was really plugging in well for me with all the things that I had watched growing up and read about George and seen. And, my dad had me watch as a kid all of these movies that George liked because he knew I liked Star Wars. So Seven Samurai was something I had watched when I was like 10. My dad had found that we watched it, I think, on Betamax or something. I don't know. It's like, it was interesting. But all these movies, American Graffiti, you start to realize how much of American Graffiti and THX is actually in Star Wars. So, I realized much too late.
Including a lot of the cast too.
Yeah, for sure. Well,
Yeah.
that's true. But to that point, I realized much too late that I think that Ahsoka really is a fusion of the character. So my mind is so full of stuff I can't remember anymore. But the young girl who hitches a ride with Milner, and she's the one that said there, tells Harrison Ford, "Your car is uglier than I am." That young girl, when you see the dynamic of Milner and her, I'm like, oh, that's very much Anakin and Ahsoka. You have this young girl who, can stand up to this cool guy with the car. That's Anakin and that's Ahsoka. And so you see these dynamics in the work. And I was applying a lot of that. The world itself, the galaxy, as it were, I don't know. When I watch the prequels, it just all makes a lot of sense to me. My friends, would debate me and stuff, but I'm like, no, I think you're looking at it wrong. I think the story is really there, and I understand the galaxy. It's much more relative in a lot of ways to our own world and history and what goes on. And so the analog for me was the kids down the street felt like Han Solo. That the galaxy far, far away should feel like it's actually really quite close, and so it's relatable. It's not this fantastic environment. It's much more close to us than, say, like Tolkien's Middle Earth in some ways. Though I read a lot of that growing up as well,
Yeah.
and I think that also helped understand how somebody builds a world. I mean, that guy built millennia. It's unbelievable.
Oh, yeah. And new languages, et cetera.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not even close there, but
I want to double tap on something because we're going kind of like big and then small and big and small. And so we talked about the world. Well, again, we still have canon coming up, but I want to talk about Ahsoka in particular.
Sure.
Because oftentimes in animation, we'll take The Simpsons, for example. Bart Simpson has been the same age for 20 some odd years. Okay. And many other animated shows follow that format that, and we as the audience will accept a timelessness to it. Again, something that's very unique about Clone Wars going into Rebels and then the television show Ahsoka, obviously the leap into Mandalorian and Ahsoka's live action, but even the transition through the Clone Wars into Rebels, you're actually watching these characters grow, and no one grows more, especially from Clone Wars through Rebels, than Ahsoka Tano. I mean, it is the opposite of The Simpsons in the sense that we're literally watching this teenager, who's like, she is like a complete teenager when she is there. But by the time, I mean, can contrast that with Rosario Dawson's kind of stoicism, in the series. So I'd like you to talk about that kind of singular journey of watching this one character make this large arc transition.
Yeah. For me, it was something that, I always felt Star Wars had this long continuity and that it did evolve and the characters grew. And so even in an animated form, I thought, I don't want to freeze these people in place. I want it to evolve, when the idea, one of the things in very early Clone Wars, especially with Ahsoka, our original version of it was quite serious, as tends to happen. I don't know why with Star Wars. It's like, we loved it as children. It was so fun and uplifting, but now we're older and we have to make it serious. So our original edit was, a young girl thrust into a war. She was trained as a peacekeeper, and boy, is she out of her depth. This is death-defying. This is tension. But George had a different take. He said, this young girl's been trained as a Jedi Knight. She is not, the moment's not too big for her. She can handle it. You guys you're taking this too seriously. You need to have more fun with this. And so, the next part of I would argue the first part of the education was how to have fun with this. And out of that came the nicknames, Sky Guy and Snips, which we were very unsure about. All that. But I have to say, no matter what it was George would pitch at me, I thought, you know what? He created Star Wars. What the heck do I know? I trust this guy, and I'm just going to try to do this in a way that I would like it, and at the time I had an assistant, and I never had an assistant before. That was new for me. And Lauren, and I would practice, how do I integrate this into dialogue by calling her Snips? Does that even flow naturally? Like, I have to test this out. How does that banter? The side effect of it that we didn't see at the time, what grew was, if you flash forward all the way when Hayden Christensen's standing there and calls Rosario Dawson Snips, for a generation of fans, that's the most nostalgic thing he could have said, because it's an older brother calling a younger sister by their nickname. Yeah. And it has this value that, had we not done that, had we been afraid of the idea and said, well, that's not cool, we wouldn't have that. And that's where George is so unique. He can really, he's like a Jedi. He can see what's happening ahead and know it's going to have value. And so she was quite snippy, which was challenging, and we all knew it. We were right on the edge with her. But I felt as she got older, if we could make her age up a little bit, we could change kind of the polarity of the story somewhat and attack. While she could still be fun and the situation could be fun, she could have a little more angst going on in her and challenging authority and things that also relate her to Anakin, because Anakin's doing very much the same thing, and make them an interesting team. And so, I'd done drawings of her slightly older that I thought would be interesting. And George agreed that it would be an interesting thing to do. Also, we wanted the battles to be pretty intense, and we wanted it to get a little more, dark at times, because the Clone Wars is a dark time. They're going to lose this war. And as we accelerated towards that end, we wanted to age, the audience up with the characters up, as it were, with the audience. Honestly,
so more like Harry Potter in essence. You're kind of growing.
Yes. Oh my
with
God.
this.
Yeah. You hit that third book and everything changes, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's on screen and in the book, so it's dynamic. And it probably unconsciously reflects my own growth, that, like, okay, I have a better handle on what I'm doing now, making the show with everybody. Let's take a step forward. And so, she is obviously my favorite character, because the most of what I do is in that character. Where with Anakin, I respect the character of Anakin at a very high level, and I know it's George's character, and I learned a lot. I was able to, with George, add depth to Anakin, I think, in making him the hero. I saw him as a kid. When I heard Obi-Wan tell Luke about Anakin Skywalker, I saw this great hero who's really cocky, a lot of bravado. I think he's the split between Han and Luke, and you get Anakin. He's brash and cocky, but he's also a bit naive and out of his depth, because he wasn't raised as a Jedi necessarily. He comes into it. So, and George was all for that. He wanted to play that out in the show, to show this side of the character that he didn't really get to do in the films. So that was fun years later when I got to do it with Hayden. Hayden was he was totally on board with that, and we had a great time. But
especially from Revenge of the Sith, for example, mm-hmm. Like Revenge of the Sith, we see at the very, very end, we see the transition from Anakin to Darth Vader. But that's really explored inside of the shows that you're doing, because, Star Wars: A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Vader is established. Like, that is a character that's established, and we see the arc of that. But mm-hmm. At the end of Revenge of the Sith, yes, he rises up and he's Vader, but there's all that time they explore in the comic books, etc., that's not an easy transition. And he's not the Vader of A New Hope, especially when he confronts Ahsoka, for example. And you get to explore a lot of that, and that's kind of our tipping into canon. The things that now you, as this person who is responsible for this world of storytelling, not just a single show, but this whole world, like, how do you choose, and as you're back then and as you're going forward, how do you choose the types of things to focus on? Because you can't make everybody happy. You can't service all these stories that are there. So how do you find the balance inside of, let's explore the first couple of years of Anakin's transition versus, we're really still following Ahsoka, or other things that you could explore, like you jump ahead in time, and the Ahsoka series is a period that's part of canon, but not one that we've really focused on before. Mm-hmm. Space whales. I mean, come on, space whales.
I love space whales. I mean, they're part of the fun for me. But I don't know. I mean, like I said, it just all seems pretty natural to me what's supposed to occur. The difference now is that we don't have George, of course. He's not part of it at this point. And I think we would all acknowledge that, who actually knows what to do and where to go. Well, it's more of a collective group that we discuss. My attitude about it now is, if you really want to know what makes Star Wars work, you watch what George made. And I'd throw THX and American Graffiti in there for sure. If you want to be educated on Star Wars and understand how, if you want to study and make a Hitchcock film, you'd study Hitchcock. So you should study George Lucas if you want to make a Star Wars film. There's a way that it's not just the way he writes it, it's the way that in the end that they learn to edit it, the way he composes it, the way he sees that universe, especially visually, is very important. So for me, especially writing, the visual component of Star Wars is on the page. It is imagined visually as well as you're writing it. So when I'm writing Ahsoka, even now, I'm doing a lot of drawings as I'm writing the scripts, and I'm giving those to Doug
Your
Chiang.
own storyboards, basically.
Basically, yeah, absolutely. And, so it becomes an important part of imagining that world and getting it realized in the way you want. But canonically speaking, it's a challenge anymore, because so many people, what I understand now is so many people have a love of Star Wars, but they come at it from slightly different angles and points of view, which kind of ties into something Obi-Wan talks about. The great many truths we cling to depend largely on our own point of view. I don't sit there honestly and think that my point of view is greater or better than anybody else's. I have what I learned and like about Star Wars. My job, as I see it at Lucasfilm, when people come to work with us, is now to listen and to help advise and give thoughts to other creatives so they can steer clear of some things that maybe I had actually slammed right into before. A lot of times if I say, I don't think that's a great idea, what the person might not realize is it's because I thought that same thing. And I asked George about it and he said, no. So, there are some things that
You're the torchbearer of it as well in some
I
ways.
guess so.
Or you're running your leg of it. How about that?
Yeah,
It's a
I'm
relay and
running
you're
my
running
leg
your
of
leg.
it. That's a nicer way to think of it.
Yeah.
As it grows and changes. I mean, we tell more stories now than we ever have.
Yeah.
Especially in live action. It's
Yes.
something that we've never experienced before. So I think that what excites me is actually the different points of view. I tend to look at it a little bit like Arthurian tales, to be honest, and how, depending on what version you're reading in translation, they can be wildly different. But Arthur's usually Arthur and does the things that he's supposed to do. Those things remain true. And that's very much folk tale and fairy tale type of ideology. If we tell a story in animation, or if it's in a comic, and then we bring it to the screen in a different way, we might make changes to it out of the medium, out of the bias of the person making it, but it should still maintain the heart and the important moments of what people liked about that story. When we bring a character like Thrawn from the pages of a book to the screen, we have to make sure that that character is going to be true to who the character is.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Not just blue. There's an essence of Thrawn.
and not just working off the popularity of the fan interest.
Yeah.
Because we go, oh, they like that. Yeah, but what do they like about it? And can you do that thing? Is that part of what we can bring to it? Otherwise, create new stuff and a new character. I think there's ample room. There's unlimited room for new in Star Wars. I don't think that we have really begun to, discover what that exactly is, as new generations of kids that grew up with Clone Wars, that grew up with the sequels, come to us and say, this is what I like about Star Wars. So, it's interesting to, again, always hear a pitch from somebody and hear what they have to say and what is it that they like about Star Wars. It turns out we like a lot of the same stuff, by the way, which that's a good thing and a bad thing, because then we all tell similar stories. So you gotta be careful of that. But yeah, canonicity, the short of it for me is, when people like the story, it seems to be canon. When they don't, it doesn't seem very much to become canon. It doesn't. That's true when we were dealing with the old expanded universe. You'd have fans fighting for some, stories, not other stories. The only canonical thing back then was if George Lucas did it.
Right.
It was very cut and dry. Now it's a bit more nebulous, and everything's canon. And I just look at it differently. Do you like the story? well, then it's canon, like for you. Like that's
Yeah.
good. I think that's fair. But we consider it all. People like to think that it is, they like to use the word policing a lot. I don't like to use that for this because it's a creative thing.
Yeah.
I think of it like a creative flow, and there's a Jedi Council, and it's like the way I look at directing. When I'm directing, I'm guiding the creative flow of everybody on the team, everybody on the set, to try to achieve the best possible outcome for this story. If I've told the story well, if everybody knows the story, if we're all on the same page, that'll happen. And it's not about getting what I want, because what's going to happen is going to be the thing it should be, because I've guided it as a director, and the team knows, and everyone has brought their particular skill and done the best they can with it and elevated it. Like, I don't imagine that what I wrote is the best thing it can be. The actor's going to add additional layers to it. Like Rosario is amazing to me, because I thought, well, how do I do this character in live action? A character that I've drawn, that I've had such an animation control of everything, how do I relinquish that to this actor? And then she did a scene, and I was like, okay, so that's going to be fine.
all of those sleepless nights are now just okay.
Yeah.
Done. Check that box.
Yeah.
Speaking of Ahsoka, let's kind of round out, because we've now answered that Dave Filoni is
I hope
not
I've answered. I don't know.
Well,
I don't know.
no, you
What
have,
I
because
answered? I never
well,
know if I answered the question.
You've
I heard
answered
I'm
the
really
question.
good at debating. So
Oh,
you
no, because you clarified for us that Dave Filoni is not the police; he's a steward. He's the guide of this.
I think so. I mean,
yeah.
Star Wars, as George made it in his films, it's the wonderful thing. It's the core of it. When I need to remind myself of what I'm missing, I go back and watch it.
Yeah.
Or American Graffiti or THX, and I kind of like, right. I refocus. This is what my task is, because you bring your own expertise and bias into it, and that's fine. And we adapt that into Star Wars now, but I think we get to better ideas that way than if it was like a yes no province, just saying yes to that, no to that. That's not interesting. I've learned over time, even if it's something I don't like as an idea, I want to hear why someone thinks that's a good idea.
Yeah.
And then we explore it, and sometimes it becomes a great idea. You never know.
Yeah. It's the Star Wars canon as jazz, not necessarily classical music. There's room for improvisation.
Right?
Yeah.
Wonderful with jazz. So
exactly. So let's round out our conversation just living inside of Ahsoka, the television series, because again, we've tracked you now on an evolution that started in an interview that you didn't think you were going to get, and now here you are, as we said, running your part of the relay race of the Star Wars universe. But in Ahsoka, the television series, you got to introduce her very actively. You were very active in the episodes that introduced Ahsoka inside the Mandalorian. But that was still Jon Favreau's show, Mandalorian, and you participated in that. And yet in Ahsoka, this is now your show. This is your opportunity to take this character that, as you said, you've been hand drawing since inception, and watch this character grow, even under your own hand, change and evolve. So as you began approaching Ahsoka as a showrunner, as everything you are to the Star Wars universe, what were you thinking? Let's go through your thought process in terms of how you were approaching the show, and then once you started executing the show, how was that? How is everything coming out in live action versus the way you would do it in animation, and how did Dave Filoni yet again evolve into this role?
Well, you want to keep evolving creatively, I think. You don't want to just get so comfortable. It's something I've taught myself. When I get comfortable, I don't think I'm being as creative as I can be anymore. It tends to take everything down, and you become satisfied, and that's no good. So, I was a 2D animator that got put on running a 3D or a computer animated show. I'd never done computers. I never had an email at work before I came to Lucasfilm. If you can imagine, it was 2005. And that was very uncomfortable. We weren't going to do storyboards. We were going to do everything in a computer. No hand-drawn stuff anymore. But then I think I learned to do some of the best work that I'd done working with that team. And so, knowing John was a massive benefit, hearing his story, knowing he wanted to introduce Baby Yoda to the world, I thought, oh boy, that could go terribly wrong. So, it seems like a home run now, but we were both, concerned because we're messing with Yoda indirectly, of course, but directly. And, I was glad I could be there to support him. But, John is John, and he's like, "You're going to direct the first episode." So I'm like, "Okay, that sounds like a gamble, but if you're willing, I'm willing." And so off I went with that, and was very involved with John in every aspect, because a lot of the production we did in Mando is very relative to animation, with its pre-production and its pre-visualization and its volume work. So I was quite comfortable. And John would as an actor, which it was such a bonus that he was an actor, because that aspect of it, the least experience with. And so he would talk about that. And as a writer, he would talk about, the subtlety and the subtext, a lot of the subtext that you need to have when you're writing live action. And, just the stuff I would write, which would be a bit broader at times and a bit, over explained. He would say, we got to draw some of that back. The actor's going to give you that. Yeah, you don't have to worry about these things as much. And so I had this great learning curve working with John and experiencing it live. But I wrote, I helped John and worked with him on all of season 1 of Mando. But I wrote pretty much on my own only one episode, which was the 5th episode of that season 1, which, I think turned out well, but it wasn't my favorite thing I'd ever done. And I felt like, I don't know if this didn't click as easily for me. I don't feel myself in that as much. So when it came to season 2, I was very adamant that, like, well, if I'm going to direct another episode, I want to write it, because I want to see, like, how's this going to go for me? And if it's even something I can do. Maybe it's not something I can do. So I told John, I said, I want to bring Ahsoka into this. And here's the outline. And John is so generous. I have to tell you, like, I pitched to John, I'm going to write this story, and I think that Ahsoka is the character that could talk to Grogu, and that's how we get his name, because she could divine it by speaking with him through the Force. And John's like, "Great, that sounds great. Go for it, do it." So I just wrote it, and I showed it to him, and he'd give me some thoughts. But that episode in the second season, episode 5, when Ahsoka appears, I just said, I'm just going all the way. I'm going to make this the samurai Kurosawa-esque.
Out of the mist, she
Yeah.
comes. Yeah.
What I've always wanted, when I wanted to see Star Wars as a kid, this is what I dreamed it would be. I'm not going to wait. It's going to be like right in the beginning of the episode. Just get right into it like George would want, and just let Rosario do her thing and design it so it looks, I was living through a lot of the forest fires in the north. We were evacuated twice in those forest fires in Sonoma County. So that was very forward in my mind. So, like, almost coping with it, I wrote that they were on this burned planet. And I just, that episode solidified for me that I really liked that medium of live action, because working with Rosario and really teaming up with her to bring that character to life, working with, Michael Biehn, and Michael's such, an experienced genre actor, been in so many movies that I loved. He had a world of thought for me on what I had written. And so Michael and I sat down and rewrote stuff right on the set together. We would get together beforehand. Ming-Na Wen was like that as well. When I worked with her, we went over her whole character. It was a collaboration that I'd never really got to have before. And it was incredibly valuable to me to work with the actors that way and let them help shape this voice. So coming out of that experience, I was like, yeah, I do want to do this as a show. I do. I really enjoyed that experience of making that episode, which is how I got to the series. The one thing Rosario and I've talked, you hit on it, you actually said the word, is the stoic nature of Ahsoka, which, she and I are I don't want to give anything away, but we're bending away from it somewhat, because it's a period in her life and the way she's behaving because of things that happened to her. I knew she wouldn't be the 14-year-old kid or the late 20s person we met in Rebels. She had learned that Anakin was her, as her mentor was Darth Vader. And that's quite a devastating thing. So for a while, she's a bit detached from people, which is why she's this, people say it, Ahsoka the Grey, which I like because I like Tolkien, of course. And I obviously feed into that quite a bit, but I promote it. But it is true. She's meant to be in this conflicted state of not wanting to teach anybody, not wanting to further this. And she's a Ronin. She's hunting down people. She's masterless. She's,
She also
but
has a very strange, I don't want to say strange. She has a very unique relationship with the Force at this point, even like, and that's also something that's evolved. Like, she stakes her own position that is less binary than any other character that has been previous, including the color of her lightsaber. You know what I mean? Like she has
here's
a
the thing.
different relationship with the Force than again that binary light side, dark side that precedes her.
Well, the force is really a balance anyway, right?
Yeah.
You're never really, you're something, and this is something I'm working on all the time. It's like, just because you overcome something one day doesn't mean you won't be challenged the next. The struggle to be a good person, unfortunately, is a struggle. I've always felt since I was a kid making the right decision for whatever reason is a lot harder than just going along with the crowd and doing the wrong decision. The force, yes, it's an energy field. We can all quote it, but it's a guide in life. It's a feeling that you have. If you train hard, you can learn to wield it, and it will heighten your abilities, heighten your senses in a way that you're more in tune with the world around you. And we are all that in our lives in different ways and different days. Like people who write for a profession, who love writing, and that's what they do. I would argue, they're most one with the force when they're writing, and they're in the zone. And some days it flows freely through them, and some days it doesn't. When it doesn't, it's because normally there are outside things influencing you, and you can't find the words, you can't hit the keys because your mind's not there. You're not being present, and you need to do that when you're writing. You have to. So all these external things that drive us, and sometimes the dark side takes us, and we do a wrong thing. Now, it's very hard when you've done the wrong thing to admit you're wrong. It's very hard for people, and something our society seems to have let go of is to say, I'm sorry. Even harder, it seems, for people to forgive people. If we go on that course, then it will dominate our destiny. Once we start down that path, you do another wrong thing, and it gets worse and worse for you because now you're afraid and you're covering things up. So, Ahsoka's balance in the Force is really that she doesn't like to claim the title Jedi. Jedi to her means very specific things. It means she was part of an order, part of an organization. The Force exists, of course, outside of the Jedi. The Jedi just learned to wield it, but she has a kind of checkered past with them, which is, I think, what makes her hesitant. And she tries to be a good person, but I think she's also challenged because most of her life she's been a warrior. Been a person that goes in and dispenses justice by cutting you down. She's fought, and she struggles with that, and that's definitely one of her characters. Later in life struggles. If she's too good all the time, also, it's not very interesting. If she's always going to make the right decision, it's not very interesting. And a lot of what I loved about Star Wars growing up was, if you think about this, obviously thought about it a lot. When you hit Return of the Jedi, Luke's never done anything really dark in the previous films that makes me think, oh, maybe he'll be a bad guy. But boy, am I worried about it in the last movie. I am so worried that he's going to give in to what the Emperor wants. I am so worried that he's right on that precipice. And I think he's been pretty great. He's helped his friends. He's blown up the Death Star. He's desperately tried to save Han. He's lost his hand fighting with his father. Like, all this stuff's going to... He seems pretty good. But no, he's right on the brink of making a terrible decision. And yet he lets that anger go because he loves his father. He puts that ahead of everything else. He's willing to die. And so, I think those are the core things I love about Star Wars, that feeling it gives you that, okay, I can overcome that darkness too. I can overcome that wickedness. And that's really us, in the dark side, seizing it for our own agency, making ourselves more powerful because we're afraid. So we can talk about that all day. Obviously, I don't
Well,
want to bore
no,
everyone with that.
we have been speaking with Dave Filoni, who, among many things, is the steward of Star Wars for our generation. And as this show, Ahsoka Tano, has its first season. Anyone who's watching this, it's up for any number of Emmy considerations. And for the writers out there, Dave Filoni has dropped the gem of gems in this podcast. If you want to write well, you just need to use the Force. And get into the flow state. Yes.
It would help.
Dave, thank you for joining us today on
My pleasure. I really appreciate you asking. So thank you so much. It's been really fun.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Third and Fairfax. You can listen and subscribe to Third and Fairfax on Spotify, Apple, and Libsyn, and watch us on the Writers Guild of America West's YouTube channel. Also check out writtenby.com, the Guild's online publication, for more on writer craft, career, and union life. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.